Welcome to this movie on brake calipers. I'm going to show you how to do a backyard repair on a brake caliper. I consider this to be a backyard repair because you don't need any special automotive tools. Everything you see here is all household or shed tooling. The only exception is compressed air, but even compressed air is easy to have at home. You need a brake caliper, you need brake cylinder grease, you need hex socket 7, you need a flathead screwdriver, some sandpaper, some oil, and for protection you need glasses and gloves. Okay, let's have a look at the caliper itself. This is a caliper of a BMW 5 Series sedan. This is the rear caliper. Interesting to see the BMW right here, the ATE right there, which is the OEM supplier. And here you have the numbers 38 and 10, meaning a 38mm piston and a 10mm brake rotor. So we now know that this piston is 38mm and the brake rotor, which goes right here in between, is 10mm thick. Other interesting parts: the caliper itself, the carrier, the rubber boot protecting the piston and the cylinder, the piston itself, the cylinder is the inside of this house, the rubbers that you see here, and the carrier bolts which are inside of these rubbers. Right here is where you fit your brake hose. Right here you have your brake bleed nipple. Let's start disassembling this caliper. The first thing we are going to do is remove the caps on the rubbers in which the guide bolts sit. We use a flathead screwdriver and we simply wiggle the caps out. This will take a little bit longer if your rubber hardened out or if you have a lot of dirt and debris, but because this is a overhauled caliper, it's really easy for me, just for purpose of the video. Right now we see the two guide bolts. On the BMW and ATE calipers, this is hex size 7, and you simply undo the guide bolts. If you have an old caliper with a lot of rust, these guide bolts can be very stuck, and you may need to put your caliper in a vise to put enough force on these bolts to get them out. I should not have much of a problem removing these bolts, since everything is brand new and lubricated. So with a small wrench, I should be able to remove the bolts. I took the tension off the bolts. Now I'm going to speed up the movie as I unscrew the bolts. With the bolts unscrewed, the carrier comes off. We're going to put the carrier away. We're going to push the bolt out of the rubber. And now we are ready to remove both rubbers. We turn the caliper, we take a flathead screwdriver, we gently push down this side of the rubber, and using your finger to pull on the rubber, you gently push with your flathead screwdriver until you have the rubber out. You can actually pierce the rubber. As you see, you can already see my flathead marks right here. But your brake caliper repair kit should have new rubber, so this is not a problem. Even if it doesn't have new rubbers and you pierce the rubber, you can still use it if you properly lubricate it. With that second rubber out, we are ready to push out the piston. Why am I not first removing the bleed nipple, assuming you have an old bleed nipple here? Reason for this is I'm going to need to use compressed air right here where you normally have your brake hose to push the piston out. Normally when you brake, your piston will move back and forth, and your brake pads and rotor make sure that your brake piston can never pop out. But since we no longer have the pads and since we no longer have the rotor, if I put compressed air on the hole right here, I will push out the piston. This is also what we want because we want to renew the piston and we want to inspect the cylinder. So we leave the bleed nipple intact so that my air, which I will apply here, will not leak through the bleed nipple. For safety, I recommend you wear glasses right now. You take a piece of cloth and you fold it that you have some cloth right here where your spring normally sits, so when the piston jumps out, it'll touch the cloth, it will not be metal to metal. So with the cloth in place, I take compressed air. I put the compressed air right here where you normally have your brake hose. I gently start applying compressed air, and with my index finger I will feel some movement on the piston. And this piston comes out real easy because everything is brand new and overhauled. Here we go. And that's enough. You see how gently I was able to push out this piston. Right now the piston with the rubber boot comes out together. We put the piston away. In your case, it could be that your piston is stuck. If this is the case, I recommend you use a lot of oil to get rid of the rust. And then you may need to apply quite some air, quite some pressure to get that piston moving again. If air is not enough, you will need pliers and you will need to wiggle a little bit on the outside of the piston to get rid of the rust and to make sure that you can actually push it out with air. Now that we have the caliper with all the parts removed, we need to remove the O-ring which is on the inside of the cylinder. To do so, we take a flathead screwdriver and very carefully, you will see the O-ring right here, very carefully we go in front of the O-ring. You make sure you do not damage the O-ring, just in case you've ordered the wrong one and need to reuse it. You put the flathead screwdriver under the O-ring, you push it upwards, and you take it out just like that. You now have a completely disassembled caliper. To remove the bleed nipple, we take the right spanner. And we gently unscrew the bleed nipple. You need to be very careful with these bleed nipples on old calipers. Reason for that is it is very easy for these nipples to be rusted shut, and since they're so thin and since they're actually hollow because you want fluid to be able to bleed out, it is very easy to strip them. If so, you need to drill them out or you need to scrap the caliper and get a new one. So if you have the idea that your bleed screw will not come off, again, use a lot of oil on the bleed screw. Put the spanner on the bleed screw and instead of undoing it, first tighten it a bit more, go back, go forward, go back, go forward, go back to forward so that you're getting rid of the rust. At some point, if you're lucky, your nipple will come off. If not, you need to look at other solutions such as scrapping the caliper or going to a machine shop where they can help you remove it. Since this is a new bleed nipple, it'll easily come out. We are now ready to inspect the caliper. Using an extra flashlight, we're going to look on the inside of the cylinder. You see some contamination on the inside of the cylinder. This is not necessarily a problem. This brake caliper has done about 25 to 30 years of work. It is very logical, especially if a car has been standing under a roof for 1, 2 or 3 years, that you have some rust on the inside of your brake parts. To remove this rust, you can use sandpaper, Scotch-Brite or a flathead screwdriver. I'm going to show you the Scotch-Brite method. We simply take a piece of Scotch-Brite, and with the Scotch-Brite in our hand, we are going to remove as much as we can on the inside of the cylinder. Since I have already done all the work on this cylinder, the cylinder feels real smooth, but you will feel exactly where you have rust and contamination on your cylinder, on your cylinder wall. Second method with the flathead screwdriver is simply looking at the worst contamination that your sandpaper or Scotch-Brite can't get rid of, and you just start to scrape off all the contaminations of your cylinder wall. It is very important with the cylinder and the grooves that you see right here that you have absolutely no rust on the edge right here, the groove where your boots sit, the middle edge, the groove where your O-rings sit, and on the cylinder wall itself. Why you don't want any rust right here? Not only does this rust develop towards the inside and will sooner or later make your piston get stuck again, but if you have rust in one of these grooves, either the O-ring or the rubber boot will be pushed out, causing all kinds of small complaints. And if you have rust on the edges right here, it'll develop into the groove, also causing the O-ring and the rubber boot to be pushed out. You want these grooves and these edges to be absolutely free of rust. Now, assuming that you have removed all the rust out of your cylinder, we're going to take a look at the piston. Now, this is a brand new piston with a brand new boot, so there is absolutely no issue with this piston. You will always see that this area is completely rusted. This is normal because this area sits outside of the protection of the boot, is not lubricated, and catches moisture, dirt, and whatnot. So this area will always be rusted. This is not really a problem. Your brake pads with the spring will actually go right inside the piston here, so that the brake pad on this side is stuck right here in the piston. Important, if you want to reuse the piston, is that this surface is smooth, uncontaminated, and free of any deep scratches or contamination. If not, you probably have to scrap the piston and get a new one. Here you have a piston of a different brake caliper. This is the front brake caliper of a Jaguar, 1999 Jaguar. You can see some contamination right here on the piston. You see some deep scratches here, more contamination here and here. I cannot reuse this piston. This piston is a risk. Even if I would sand this piston with light sandpaper or Scotch-Brite, maybe even wet sanding, I could make it look real smooth, but I run the risk that the pitting that I will cause right here will make that this piston will no longer have a seal on the O-ring, which is on the inside of the cylinder. So this is typically a piston that you need to scrap. I always keep these pistons reserved, so I have the original size in case stuff becomes difficult to order, and because I can use them right before I finish a caliper to spray paint the caliper. What I will simply do is, let's assume this is the old piston. We put the old piston in like this, and now I can spray paint the entire caliper without contaminating the inside of the cylinder. Assuming you have properly prepared your cylinder walls, we take a new or a repaired piston and we're going to test how it will slide back and forth without the O-ring installed. If the piston or if the cylinder has contamination, you will not get a perfect slide that you see right here. I can use only my fingers and move the piston back and forth, and I can even feel the pumping right here where you normally have your brake hose. This means that right now piston and cylinder wall do not touch each other. You have a free moving piston. The O-ring takes care of the seal. The piston and cylinder wall do not have to seal. It's the O-ring that takes care of the seal. I am almost ready to start assembling. We've checked the cylinder, we've checked the piston, we've checked the rust right here. Since I've used sandpaper and since I've scraped off some rust, I need to use compressed air to blow everything out of the cylinder. So we're using compressed air. To clean the cylinder. You can also use a piece of cloth if you don't have any compressed air for this. Right now we are ready to grease the cylinder, we are ready to grease the piston and to install. We take some brake cylinder grease, put some brake cylinder grease on our index finger. With the caliper in one hand, we use the brake cylinder grease on our index finger and we grease the cylinder. The cylinder walls have now been greased. Now we take the flathead screwdriver. We put some brake cylinder grease on the flathead. And we are now going to put the brake cylinder grease in both grooves and on the edges between the grooves and the final edge outside where you have the rubber boot. And why do we want to grease this area? The brake cylinder grease will protect this area from moisture and will protect this area from rusting. Now naturally, sooner or later there is no brake cylinder grease left, and sooner or later this piston will start to rust again. But if this piston is ready for another 10 years and if this saves you the cost of having to buy a new one, you've actually earned yourself some money. I'm going to add some more brake cylinder grease because I want to be absolutely sure that this piston is up for the job. And with the grease on the cylinder wall, in the grooves and on the edges, the caliper is ready. We now take the piston, we put some brake cylinder grease on the piston, and we put the cylinder grease all over the piston. You can also put some brake cylinder grease right here on top of the piston, so it takes a little bit longer for this area to rust, but sooner or later this area will rust anyway. We now take a brand new rubber boot, put a little bit of grease on the rubber boot, we lubricate the rubber boot, make sure you also put some grease on the inside of the rubber boot, and the rubber is ready to be installed. Final part is the O-ring. Put some grease on the O-ring, and the O-ring is also ready to install. Now, quite simple, we first need to install the O-ring. So using only your fingers, you put the O-ring in the groove and you gently put the O-ring in that groove all around, making sure you do not get a corkscrew in your O-ring. When you have your O-ring seated, you put the piston on the table the way you see here, with the hole of the brake hose towards you. And now we need to deploy a little trick. We need to get this piston in this way so that we have the pad right here on the outside. We also need to have the rubber boot seated right here and seated in the outer groove right there. There's a little trick to do so. You put the boot over your piston with the large diameter facing the rear of the piston. You will see that as you move the boot over, it'll get the small diameter area will get into the groove where it should sit, but we don't want this yet. We want to move the boot over that area. We want to make the boot stick out by, let's say, 0.5 centimeter. And with this area sticking out, we are able to put the area in the outer groove. And when this area sits fully in the outer groove, we will push the piston in. And as we push the piston in, the groove of the piston and the other side of the boot will connect to each other. So gently, we put the boot in place of the groove. It is important that you first do the lower side, because you cannot see this side, so you cannot correct your work. And then you do the upper side of the caliper, which we are looking at right now. And you need 2 hands for this job. You cannot do this with 1 hand. And now that I have the piston a little bit over the O-ring on the inside, I'm first going to check if my rubber boot is all the way in. And it is. It appears to be all the way in, seated in the groove. Now I'm going to put the caliper down. I'm going to use my fingers with my palms here against the ears of the caliper. And I gently push the piston inside. You will feel when pushing the piston inside that it correctly slides into the O-ring. And as I push the piston inside, the small diameter side of the boot goes into the groove of the piston. If I screwed up, I will now see the boot bulging out in some direction. It could be here, right there, or on the other side. So we're going to check and make sure that my rubber protector is not bulging anywhere. And it doesn't seem to be bulging out anywhere. So I've properly assembled this piston. Right now we can install the bleed nipple again. We no longer need to do anything with air. I always put a very little bit of brake grease on that bleed nipple, because you're putting the bleed nipple in old thread, which may be still a little bit contaminated. We put the nipple in by hand. I don't tighten it. I will only tighten it once I'm done bleeding, so that you don't over tighten it. So this is just hand tight, which is enough for now, because we're not going to bleed yet. This caliper is not on the car yet. We can use a little bit of brake cylinder grease to make it easier to install our new rubber. And to install the rubber, we simply put it inside the ear of the caliper. And you press it in. And the better job you did on restoring the caliper housing, the easier this stuff slides in. But the grease does help a lot. And with those rubbers in the ears, we are ready to put the carrier back together. Now, I said that these carrier bolts were new, but they were not. I see that these are carrier bolts that I repaired. You don't really repair anything, you just make sure that the surface is smooth again, you sand it down, you make it smooth, and these carrier bolts will be ready to go for another 10 years. We're going to put some grease on the carrier bolts, we're going to put them in the carrier, and we're just going to slide the carrier in. Some grease on number 1, some grease on number 2. We're going to put those carrier bolts in by hand. We will tighten them when we have the carrier in position. With these bolts greased, they will move easily through the rubbers. We now take our hex key again, and we just hand tighten the bolts. When you have the caliper on the car and the caliper is fixed to the car, you can put a bit more torque on it, but for now I just want to hand tighten my caliper bolts. I take the 2 caps, I put the caps on, and my caliper is assembled. Summarizing this job, the most important part is checking whether your cylinder wall is okay, whether your piston surface is okay or just renewing the piston, and whether the grooves in the edges of the O-ring and the rubber booth are okay. Most difficult job is properly installing the booth and the piston. You may need to have some patience, and if you are not sanding your caliper, or if you're not sandblasting and painting your caliper, the rust on the outer area may actually sabotage your attempts and it may take some time, but over time you'll get the hang of it and you'll easily push in any piston in any caliper. I hope you like this movie. I hope you learned something from this movie. If you like my movies on these backyard repairs of car parts, please subscribe to my channel.